Hey everyone, welcome to the Amplitude of Tech podcast. I'm Shawn, Chief Marketing Officer of Amplix. Today we have Ed Keisling. He's the Chief AI Officer at Progress Software. This was a great conversation, maybe one of my favorites on the podcast. It was wide-ranging. We talked about a lot of areas of AI and practical tips that will help you get AI adopted and scaled in your business. Listen to this conversation. It's a really good one. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. All right, Ed Keisling, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here, Shawn.
Great to have you. Why don't you just take a few seconds and talk about who you are, where you come from, and what your company does?
Sure thing. So I work at Progress Software. I'm currently the Chief AI Officer there. I've been in that role for about a year and a half now. I have about 30 years in the industry. I have spent about 17 or 18 years at Pegasystems, which is located in Burlington, Mass. Spent 6 to 7 years at a small healthcare robotics company where I ended up being the acting CIO for a bit, and have spent the last 9 years or so at Progress, leading different product and engineering teams. So what Progress does is we enable organizations to deploy, manage, monitor, configure sort of rich digital experiences and applications. I think one of the more interesting things that we've been doing more of late is really trying to help organizations unlock all of the unstructured data that they have within their organization through solutions such as like Agentic RAG.
Well, that's a perfect place to start because you've got one of the sexiest new acronyms in the industry, which is the CAIO designation. How did Progress decide that it was time for a CAIO?
Yeah, so it's funny, right? I sometimes kid with people. I say, well, I was prior the chief crypto officer, but that didn't work out so well. But I wanted to jump on the next trend. But I think at Progress we had a very specific problem to solve. So I think the thing that probably brings most clarity to folks is that we don't actually have a chief technology officer, and we actually have a fairly complex business. In that we have multiple products that are sort of organized into different BUs. And we needed, I think, a lot more sort of intentional orchestration across how AI was being used across each of those different BUs. And so I'll give an example, which is that, I think one of the great things of Progress is that the team really leaned in heavily into AI very early, but that created some interesting challenges, which is that, the minute that MCP comes out or the minute this new technology comes out, we sometimes have 7 or 8, 9 different sort of flavors of that same technology. And that sort of dilutes sort of the impact in terms of being able to sort of do that. And so my role is really to try to figure out how we can better coordinate sort of those activities across all the different business units, really sort of drive reuse and sort of better enablement, but also, product capabilities within the different products, and really trying to identify some of the common components as we build AI systems that can be used across.
So it's really a multifunction, but also cross-functional role, and you're spending a lot of time within the business identifying use cases, either internal or customer facing. What exactly are like the day-to-day responsibilities of a CAIO? I keep wanting to say EIEIO, but
Yeah, exactly. My friends say like chow chow, right? But I think so I have a small team that is sort of oriented around sort of enablement for the folks within engineering, and also some of these cross-product capabilities, right? And so for reference, we have about 1,200 people that are leveraging Copilot Studio or GitHub Copilot Studio at Progress. And so my role is really to try to figure out how we can best enable and sort of drive adoption within that cohort. And so, what we do within my team is that we have folks on my team sort of focused on enablement, sort of finding and identifying and enabling the AI champions within the organization. We've launched an initiative that we call sort of the Vanguard program. So these are sort of like the front of the pack in terms of our most sort of forward-looking sort of AI evangelists in terms of getting them together as a cohort so that they can grow and learn from each other. We do sort of bi-weekly training with Microsoft in terms of any of the new capabilities that they're coming out with. So, we'll have several hundred people a week be jumping on one of these sessions that we have to learn more about, some of the product capabilities that Microsoft is doing. And then, I mentioned we're sort of focused on reuse. So the challenge is that if somebody builds something in a silo, how do we get visibility into that across the organization? And how do we be more intentional about making sure that if somebody does actually build something, that they've gotten a sort of input from some of the other stakeholders from across the organization so that it could be reused if they were to build it? Right. So I think that that's one portion in terms of how we do that. We have an AI capability board that we run things through. And then it's also about sort of the intake, right? Which is it's a discovery challenge, which is that, like most organizations, I think that there are all these different assets that are being created. How do you actually make it so that if I'm saying, hey, I want to build an MCP server that's going to connect these two systems together, I want to discover artifacts in terms of how to manage, monitor, govern that, right? And I don't want everybody sort of rebuilding some of those components from the ground up. And so my team sort of helps sort of enable that as well too.
Got it. I love the idea of the Vanguard thing. So just if I understand this, you've got these kind of pioneers, I'll say, or early adopters or power users of the AI internal tools that you've rolled out. And so you use them as a success story and social proof amongst their peers, create an environment of learning and kind of cross pollination. Is that right?
Yeah, and so the cohorts have maybe sort of slightly different sort of focuses. So when we are thinking about sort of our vanguards, we're really trying to say, like, how fast could we actually go with AI? Like, where are the limits in terms of how we could take AI and apply it to our organization? And maybe if we were to relax some of the constraints around inference or access to tools or governance, right? Can we create environments for them to sort of do really sort of wild experimentation in
Mm.
sort of like a safe, controlled way where they have access to IT or myself or leadership in order to sort of support and drive some of that change, right? These are, I think, really much more, could be potentially much more disruptive initiatives that we are sort of partaking in progress. And how do we fund and sort of create an environment there? And I think what this also allows them to do is that this is a very small cohort. They can, when they typically have questions, nobody else can answer these questions, right? Because they're off way on the horizon, but like together, they can sort of find answers and sort of advance the ideas in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. And so, for instance, the Vanguard cohort in our organization, as you might expect, has the largest inference budget in terms of AI credits that are being allocated out, which is something that we just put into place. And so that's sort of the intention of there. Just sort of extending this out. So what did the other people do? I mentioned that we have a champions cohort. The intention of the champions is really to try to figure out how we can scale some of the AI best practices across the organization. And again, we have sort of a hub and spoke at Progress. So if we identify a change or a capability or some new tool that we want people to use, the challenge that we have is getting that to every one of the 1,275 people that might be on GitHub Copilot, right? And so the champions sort of understand within each of their different regions, because we're a global organization and we have offices in Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, India, Ireland, et cetera, right? So how do we take sort of the general guidance and make that sort of bespoke for the different regions and make that meaningful for them? And then to also make sure that we have follow through in terms of whatever initiative that we're rolling out, right? So the two different sort of sides in terms of how do we approach that.
So Vanguard is the DARPA and champions are the
Yeah.
media
We
influencers.
used to work with DARPA at one of my previous companies, but
Oh, is
yes,
that
yeah,
right? Oh, that's a different podcast. We'll get into that.
yeah,
All right. So it sounds like you guys have really focused a lot on building a culture around AI. And I know that's one of the areas where adoption can go flat, whether we're talking AI or we're talking software as a service or, whatever initiative you're rolling out, right? It's all about getting buy-in and adoption. So how did you approach building this kind of culture?
yes. So we started this journey probably a little over a couple of years ago, and we started with a smaller cohort, right? I think we were sort of testing the waters to try to figure out. And I think everybody's still in the same boat. Like what is real, what is actually organization. But we started with some of the thought leaders that we sort of trusted their opinion and gave them access to the tools and started to do some experimentation, do some hackathons, do some sort of controlled experiments. And I think once we started to realize that there was some real value there, we started to scale it out across the organization and tried to make it fun in terms of hackathons and We didn't set up any of these crazy sort of inference leaderboards that you're hearing about today, but really tried to make it so that like this was a tool, another tool that they could have in their tool belt that would hopefully make them more effective with their job. I think the reality is that like there was like a lot of doubt, right? Because there's obviously this headwind in terms of jobs and what this is going to mean for your job and is AI going to replace engineers? I would say that we got over that probably a little over a year ago. And the reason that we got over that and really started to sort of see exponentials in terms of adoption and utilization and I think outcomes and we are literally on exponentials because I look at these metrics every day and they terrify me is that I think that the engineers got to a point where they realized that like I am the person, like I am so critical for this AI to be successful that like there is no way you could do this without me, right? And I think they sort of once the point that they realized that they were indispensable in the process, albeit that maybe the way that they would go about their work and their role in terms of how they were doing their working was shifting, but like the all of those really critical decisions and the architecture and really sort of like what makes software enterprise grade, which is what we really care about at Progress. Once they sort of got over that hump, then like it was off to the races, right? And so we just started to see more and more people, I think, lean in. And again, as I'm looking at some of these charts, right, the problem is now that we are using AI very, very extensively, I think within engineering, and then now it's like how do we more responsibly use AI?
I think a lot of enterprises are kind of in a position, let's say mid-market enterprises are in this position where AI adoption is happening, but it's happening in different places within the organization. There's kind of an atomization of AI initiatives, shadow AI, you could call it, maybe not always, right? But often that's happening, and different departments may be kind of operating in silos, and so there's probably a need for this role in every organization just for the coordination between stakeholders and discovering use cases. But not every organization is in a place right now where they can carve out another C-level position. So what advice would you give those technology leaders to kind of put that function in place without the title?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just came back from a conference, and a lot of my peers there were program managers, right? Program managers that were maybe leading up agile transformations at their organization that were now leading up sort of AI transformations. And I think that that is not a bad spot for this to land because I think when you think about the types of problems that you're trying to solve with AI, it's really not about AI, and there's too much damn hype around AI, right? Saying that even with my title, but I think the core of it is just trying to sort of understand what are the types of problems that we need to sort of solve? What are the value streams that we need to look at as an organization? How do we drive top line? How do we reduce our expenses? And like the program managers, or at least the many of the program managers and the transformation folks that are heading up the transformations, like that's what they've been looking at all along, right? It's not like trying to drive efficiencies within organizations is like a new idea, right? So as long as I've been in tech, you're always trying to figure out how you can sort of make something a little bit faster, a little bit cheaper, right, with higher quality. It's just that we now have like a different tool in our toolkit that dramatically accelerates our ability to sort of do that across the organization, right? And so I think the program managers, I think, can drive a lot of this. Zapier actually has sort of an interesting sort of phrasing for this, which is one of the conferences that I was at recently. And they sort of frame this through the lens of sort of spotters and builders. And so I think the program managers, they don't have to build the solution, right? But I think they can help spot the problem, and then you can resource how you actually implement that within IT or engineering, or from marshaling some resources from somewhere else.
So if you're going to bring a program manager into that kind of role, do you think that there needs to be some sort of standardized education across those roles so that they can effectively spot something that AI can solve?
Yeah, I would say it's like a split mind that they need to bring. So it is a program manager, but it's sort of a program manager plus, right? I think what I've always sort of shared is that like you need to sort of approach this transformation two ways, right? And so one way is sort of what we were just talking about from sort of program manager perspective, which is that we have all these value streams that exist within the organization, right? From concept to cash, or like different flows that basically drive revenue for our organization. I think the first place that you need to start in order to create room to sort of really transform your organization, right, is just by taking sort of some of the low-hanging fruit out of that process, right? In making that a little bit more efficient. I don't think that that's where you want to end, but I think the reality is that so many people are so damn busy, right? That like when you ask them to take on something else, they're like, I already have the work of 700 people, right? Like, and now you're asking me to do AI, you're asking me to reinvent this process. Like, what the hell, right? So I think if you can like eliminate some of that load, right, by finding 15, 30 minutes a day within their workflows so that they can breathe a little,
Mhm.
right? That I think reduces some of the barrier that many of them have in terms of like, okay, like now I have at least a little bit of time to sort of get my head around that. Or you can say, hey, use that 15 or 30 minutes a day and now go play with these tools that we've sort of purchased you, right? But I think in parallel, what needs to happen is that like really the opportunity is to sort of reinvent how you do your work, right? And sort of take a more declarative approach to this is the outcome that we're trying to drive. Given this outcome that I'm trying to drive, what are the bits of data information process that need to sort of occur in order to drive that? And could I do that in a fundamentally different way with agents, or could I eliminate steps? Right, a lot of times the best AI is no AI, which is that like you just decide I don't need to do that anymore, right? Or that step was a result of something that we introduced 15 years ago. Something really, really bad happened. My boss said, like, if that ever happens again, you're going to get fired. And so, for the 15 years since then, everybody's been doing that same damn step, and we have no idea why, right? And so I think, but I think that that's where sort of like a lot of the gains can come in terms of like really trying to have a parallel stream in terms of like what does that look like if you were to truly.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the conversations that I'm having in real life and on this podcast now, people are starting to bring up, you don't need AI for everything. And that's counter to what those conversations were like last year. Last year it was like, you need AI for everything, right? So there seems to be a shift in the way the wind.
I'm in camp. You definitely do not need AI for everything, and it is not the best tool for everything, right? And it's maybe a worse tool for everything, right? In some cases, right? But
Yeah, yeah. And I think we could talk about the cost impact of that later. But I wanted to ask though, is there like an obvious tipping point where a business can see these signs or signals and say, now's the time we need this chief AI officer?
when you need a chief AI officer, so
Yeah.
I think definitely when you start to see overlap in terms of multiple people building the same thing, right? Or sort of uncoordinated hackathons across the organization. I think one of the challenges with AI is that like if you don't provide consistent enablement, there's a challenge of people sort of like chasing shiny objects and potentially being counterproductive in terms of what you're trying to achieve as an organization. And so I think that would be sort of a good time to sort of introduce AI as well too, right? And so what do I mean by that, right? Which is that I think AI is such a natural amplifier, I think, of the best people that we all have in our organizations, right? And I think it's very easy for all of us to get infatuated with how well and how amazing these people are sort of going out and building capabilities within the organization, right? But what we have, Progress has 3,000 plus employees, right? So for larger organizations, the challenge that we are facing is sort of a diffusion problem, which is that we need everybody not to be as good as the best people, but like to be knowledgeable in terms of what the tools are capable of and be able to sort of navigate that and make smart decisions with AI. And this is sort of a tangent, right? But the way that I sort of think about this is that like I think we've all seen this, which is that you give sort of somebody AI and they have an idea, but they don't have like the full idea in terms of what's going on. They can very rapidly cycle through a bunch of different prompts and arrive at a completely wrong conclusion that could be very disruptive for your business or just outright incorrect, right? And the way that I sort of think about that is like this 80% rule, right? So if I ask AI something and I ask it to create a very detailed plan and it gets 80% of it correct, and for whatever reason, I as an end user failed to detect that there are some like meaningful errors in terms of the output. And this is very easy to do when AI is hemorrhaging, sort of like text back at you. you could think about like multiple turns. If I just do 2 or 3 turns of 80, I'm at basically a coin flip in terms of whether or not that output is actually meaningful at all, right? And so you need to give people enablement. And I think to your point is what is the signal, which is that if you're saying, hey, like, why am I not seeing the benefits from AI? It's like, well, you may have a challenge where like a lot of this AI is going to solve problems that don't actually drive the top line or for your business, right? So
Yeah. It almost sounds like this needs to be part of the strategy and the roadmap for AI, because I would think you wouldn't want to go in and ask the board for budget for AI, and then they
right.
come back eventually, because they will, and say, where's the ROI on this? And you're like, it's coming, but I need to get this really expensive headcount in order to get that ROI squeezed out, right? So you should
Yeah,
probably have that baked in.
exactly.
Yeah. So if someone was listening to this conversation that is not in tech, they would come away with the impression, I think, thus far, that every business is up to their elbows in AI. Are there still businesses out there that have not, and I mean, mid cap and larger businesses that have not started to adopt AI and are still greenfield, not including shadow AI?
Yeah. So I think, I think that this pivot occurred for most organizations many years ago, which is that all companies started to become technology companies, whether they sort of realized it or not, right? And so we saw this with Tesla, where like we thought we were, and you can sort of think about how that is sort of extended to other industries as well too. So I think technology has always been a differentiator in terms of the types of customer experiences that you could deliver for people. But I think that there was always a ceiling in terms of what people could sort of deliver as a result of that. And so I think with AI, like it just opens up the possibilities in terms of like how you can sort of approach and solve and sort of serve your customers. And it gives you a very big, meaningful lever in order to sort of do that. My sense is that like most organizations have entered sort of the experimentation point where they are adopting tools. I think there's been a huge run on Anthropic and Claude Code and Claude Work over the last 6 months. I've certainly heard a lot more chatter from some of my peers in terms of like, our organization has said, just go get Claude and figure it out, right? You have the budget. Let's just go make it happen. And so I think we've reached that tipping point where probably the middle majority, right, is going off in adopting. I think for the folks that have not started yet, it is going to be really difficult unless you're a very small organization to pivot because these other folks have sort of started. So for reference, though, so at the conference that I was at, we did ask this question, and there were maybe 30 of us in the room. And we said, how many of you have not gotten a mandate from your CIO or not CIO, from your CEO to basically use AI? There was only one person out of the 30 that had not stepped up, right? So there are still pockets, and I still hear this when I talk to some consultants, that there are still some organizations, still some very large organizations that are just starting to give access to the tools. And again, there's a diffusion problem, right? Giving access, you are still going to talk months, years before these people are comfortable with the tools.
Total tangent, but you mentioned Tesla. Are you a car guy by chance?
I am a car guy. Yes, absolutely. So yeah.
Did you see Ferrari's new Luce, the EV that they put
Oh
out?
no, I have not, but I'm sure my kids have. We went to the Ferrari museums actually a few years ago, and my kids we were in heaven. So
It's a complete disaster, man. It's a very ugly, very un-Ferrari design, and they want $640,000 for it. And if you're a Ferrari purist, what you want is the
yeah,
10
I want a Ferrari.
is
Yeah,
under you. Yeah, like
I only want one car. Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, I'll have to
Jack.
check it out. I'm sure my kids know about it. So
The car world has suffered two great losses here because Jaguar's going all EV, and they totally destroyed the design. I mean, it's a nightmare.
I am in the camp of save the manual. So all of my my daily driver is the automatic, but everything else that is fun has a
Yeah.
stay. Right. So I'm in the camp of like, I actually like to drive cars. So
Yeah, I do, but yeah, I think BMW, the new M3 is coming out with a manual. Anyway, so back to AI. It's rare that I get to talk about anything but AI on this podcast. I'm going to rebrand it to the AI podcast because I literally don't know what to talk about that doesn't touch on AI anymore. Like
Yeah, it's so much chatter about it, right? Like it's
yeah,
overwhelming.
and like you have to talk about, it's not like anyone's going to listen to an episode on POTS replacement. So very few people have not ventured into AI adoption, and that means that the majority have at some level. You just were a panelist at our event that we had in Cape Cod, our Technology Leadership Summit, and the whole point of that event and the theme of it was an assumption and an acknowledgement that people have started adopting AI now. It's not where we were 2 years ago, and they're saying, where do we start? So, they're already, on first or rounding second, but they don't, they never put the things in place that they should have at the beginning, right? So they took a shotgun approach and they don't have the governance in place. They might not have the security measures in place. They might not have the training and education for their employees in place. So the idea of the event was how do you go back now and start from the beginning? So what is the difference in the approach of someone that's starting from scratch versus someone that's maybe skipped some of those steps? And if they did skip those steps, what are the most important ones that they need to go back to?
Yeah, so I would say that this is an organizational transformation, right? And I think it needs to have clear leadership support from the top in terms of why are you undergoing this transformation and why is it important to the business, right? I think too often it can be perceived, right? Because we've all heard these stories before in terms of like, management goes and they read a book and now your company strategy has changed, right? But with AI, I think a lot of people sort of hear that like, hey, we want to roll out AI because we want to drive greater profits for the organization so that I can go buy a bigger boat, right? And I don't think that that's like a super inspiring challenge for people to hear. But I do think that most organizations, I'm sure there are some companies that are unfortunately like that, but I think most organizations they have an existential crisis in terms of like there is a big risk in terms of the types of services, the types of products that you provide being significantly disrupted by AI. And that like I think it's very important for leadership to clearly articulate exactly what are those risks and what are the potential opportunities and what is in it for not only the employee but potentially the organization, right? And make it much more sort of a collective approach. But I think that is good, right? You obviously need to provide the budget and access to the tools and you know policies and other things to sort of enable people to act. I think a lot of the mistakes. So if one of the mistakes that we certainly made was that like we had an AI policy, and I think it was like 20 pages long, right? And granted, there was some filler at the beginning and end, but like people would read the AI policy and they would be so damn afraid to do anything that the safest, because at the end of the policy is like, well, if you don't follow this policy, you're fired, right? It's like, and then like, and I, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that this is probably not dissimilar to many organizations, right? Is that like you get so up on like what you cannot do, right? Don't do this, don't do this, worry about this, data privacy that, right? Is that I think the better approach and what we actually ended up doing at Progress 18 months ago is that we simplified that and tried to sort of be like, this is what you can do, right? This is what there are controls for you to sort of experiment safely with. This is the process for sort of getting additional help. And granted, some of those processes I think are still evolving, but more in terms of like what are the possibilities, right? So now leadership has sort of created that space where people can sort of feel like it's safe to experiment, it's safe to make mistakes, etc. But then it's a challenge of sort of finding those vanguards and those champions, right? The people who can sort of grow this from the inside out and create the wins, showcase the wins, build on the momentum, right? Really sort of celebrate success in terms of people making it a dramatic change. We were attempting to, although this fizzled out, but I want to try it again in terms of like highlighting the failures, right? Like if Failure Friday, I think was what we were sort of calling it at some point in terms of just like, it's okay if you tried something and it failed, but like, what did you learn, right? And try to make that sort of fun from sort of a culture perspective. But I think again, it's just an organizational change in terms of like how can you articulate why this is important and what they can grow from, and why this is important for their careers and sort of their jobs and for the organization, but then really try to just find the people and get out of their way. You had talked about sort of shadow AI. I wanted to touch on that because it's just sort of interesting. Is that like obviously shadow AI is a concern. We have shadow AI at Progress that we're constantly monitoring. I think getting some visibility into sort of what the tools the teams are using is actually really interesting because it may be actually identifying where you have gaps in terms of what you're providing in terms of tooling to your organization, right? To me, they're like clues as to like we're giving everybody access to X and we think that this solves their problem, but yet everybody is going off and using Y. Like, why are they using Y? Like, I think there's information there that is a signal of like there may be misalignment between what you've provided and what they need, right? In trying to sort of get people in a governed way to sort of where they need to be, I think is the opportunity that sort of comes from the shadow AI. Like you can obviously you have to block access to DeepSeek. You have to block access to some of the Chinese models. Like you have to do obviously the smart things to sort of protect your business. But I think that there are some places at the edges where you can use it as signals.
Yeah, that's a great call out. If let's say you invested in something like Zoom Revenue Assistant,
Right.
and but people are still signing up for Gong or some other note taker or something, right? Like maybe there's something that ZRA is not doing, or Revenue Accelerator, not Assistant, but
Yeah. And it's the question that you were asking before too. What is the signal like when you need a chief AI officer, right? Which is that like something is happening there, right? Like either, and we see this with Copilot 365 all the time. People are like, oh, I need Anthropic to do X. And then we ask like, well, have you tried it in Copilot 365? And they're like, no, we haven't yet, right? Or they didn't know how to sort of do the second or third prompt and get like a 95% result in Copilot. And so it's like either the tool sucks, right? And we actually do need to get a new tool, or we actually failed to enable you on the tool that we gave you, and you don't actually know how to take the most advantage of it, right? And I think
yeah,
that's sort of the discovery that needs to occur.
yeah, that's the shining light, blinking light that you need to inspect that a little bit closer. And I want to point out that what I keep hearing from you is culture. You've really gone out of your way to build a culture around AI and around AI usage. And I love all the talk of enablement, and I love the idea of kind of flipping the script and not saying don't do this, but rather you can do this, because humans weight negativity more than positive things. Like it hurts more to lose $20 than it feels good to gain $20, and that's
Yeah, exactly.
that's a evolutionary thing. So people are already a little bit nervous about it. If you start filling their head with all these negative things and how scary it can be, then it really is going to slow down adoption.
Yeah.
So I think when we were doing a planning call, you brought up an example of a top 10 accounting firm that had to start over. They had rolled out some adoption. They had adopted some AI initiatives, and it was early, and they have found that these were not the right things, and they had to kind of start from scratch. Can you talk about that experience a little bit?
Yeah. The way I sort of think about this is sort of the builder and spotter challenge, right? And we actually made I almost did this at Progress as well too, and I pulled back on it, which is that again we got so enamored with the builders, right? With all of the incredible demos that people were building, the new dashboards, the agentic workflows, like the automations within engineering. And we said, oh, we want everybody to be doing that. And then I very quickly realized that like, no, we don't actually need everybody to be using Claude Code and sort of going out and vibing everything at the same time, because that's really counterproductive. Because what we'll end up having is a whole bunch of people solving a perceived problem that they have that's very tactical and not maybe thinking sort of strategically enough in terms of the problem to be solved. And you have a whole bunch of bespoke systems now that like may not be governed or sort of registered that you now are probably not managing. And so it goes back to sort of like the right problem to solve, right? I think there has to be sort of intention in terms of these are the types of problems that we think are going to drive the most value for our department, for our business. Uh, how can we, in a controlled way, get a few people to try to solve that problem, right? And build an application that many people can then use, instead of trying to have everybody sort of go and automate their inbox, 10 different ways, right? And so I think what happened at the accounting organization was that, like, they just realized that there were too many applications that were being built by people that had incomplete information in terms of what was the goal to be achieved. That was leading to disruption because, if you think about this, arrows all pointing in a direction, like a bunch of those arrows were pointing in the wrong direction, and we're actually creating drag in terms of the velocity, right? And we had talked about, I think, the MIT study at the conference that you guys ran. I used to think that the MIT study was like complete crap. And in fact, it still is complete crap, right? I think it was not a very good study. It was a very small study. There may have been ulterior motives in terms of why MIT was publishing that study. Full disclosure, I do a lot of work with MIT, and but a terrible study, right? But I think the premise of it is that, like, when you're trying to scale this across an organization, and you're trying to connect value streams, and you have all of these different parts of your organization going a slightly different direction, they are failed projects, right? Like, it's a failed investment of time in terms of it didn't accomplish the intended outcome. They took time away from something to do something that wasn't needed when they could have been doing something else, right? And so I think it's maybe they have learned something, right? But I think you could argue that what you really need to do is to create another venue for them to learn and to engage with AI that was more meaningful in terms of what your organization was trying to accomplish, right? And so, but I think that a lot of these IT projects just ended up sort of going sideways. The other thing that I would say with that MIT study, again, you didn't ask this, is that, like, most IT projects fail. Like, if you're running those types of experiments, you're going to expect a high failure rate, right? That is, if you're not failing, you're not trying, right? The whole point of what we're trying to do is to innovate and be at the edges, and so you would expect some portion of failure.
Two things that I think are positive about that study that it identified are, one of them may be self-serving for us, but it really shined a light on the pilot to scale gap. And so even if a pilot is not necessarily intended to scale, maybe it's just an experiment, but you should be going into these experiments with scale in mind, right? So planning for what that next step is going to be and budgeting for that scale as well is probably something to think about as you're designing these pilots. And then the second thing, which is the self-serving thing, is they identified that teams that worked with a partner like Amplix or, some third party that had expertise in AI, they had a higher success rate of scaling and realizing ROI.
Yeah, 100%. And so I actually just wrote I could not agree more. I just wrote a LinkedIn article that was sort of saying that, echoing, I think, many of the same sentiments, which is that, and so the premise of the article that I just wrote was that, SaaS isn't dead. We're being misled. That was basically the title. But that underlying all of this AI hype, when you actually try to bring a lot of these things to production, it is really flipping hard and complicated, and made even more complex by the fact that you are trying to implement and manage and monitor non-deterministic systems, right? It is a whole new world that people need to navigate that is being, like, completely glossed over by all of, and that the way that organizations are sort of like masking this is that, they're all going crazy in on, forward deployed engineers, right? So forward deployed engineer is like the new hottest job, but I was sort of arguing that a forward deployed engineer is just really sort of professional services in disguise, right? In you're masking that, like, something that I should be able to do on my own with your tool is admittedly, like, beyond the capability of what I could potentially do, right? If we need all of these forward deployed engineers, in that it's a strong signal that, like, maybe it's not as easy or as turnkey as what you see on X.com or on YouTube, right? From all these influencers just saying, I reinvented my workflow overnight. It's like, well, Mike, maybe you did, but, like, you're not actually running a business and you're not in an enterprise, right? But the answer for Amplex, right, is that, like, how does an organization solve that? Is that you partner with people that have solved problems for you before, that deeply understand your business, that deeply understand your pain points, that have a vested interest in your success, right? And you don't get that from some random forward deployed engineer that's going to be on your team for 3 to 4 months and then walk out the door with all the knowledge, right? And so that was sort of my thesis for sort of SaaS is not maybe dead, right? Which is that like you have all these services organizations, you have all these software companies, like those are your forward deployed engineers because they have in your forward deployed organizations because they have the customer relationships, they have the understanding, they have the domain expertise, right, to actually do these things at scale, enterprise grade, for their customers.
Yeah, that's what I always tell people is, if you're trying to get stronger and you go into the gym and you do one rep and leave, you're not going to get stronger. But
Is this my
if
problem? Is that
that's it, man, that's the secret.
you weren't supposed to call me out at the
That and get your protein.
yeah.
But if you've got someone that's doing the reps day in, day out, then that muscle starts to grow. And so, when we I don't want this to be a shameless plug for Amplix, but when we approach a project, we've got thousands of reps behind it, right?
Right.
So, we've been through the learning curve. We know the landscape of things. And that's especially important right now with AI because I mean, really nobody knows what the hell's going on here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if someone comes across as an expert, they're lying to you. They've got an ulterior motive, to your point about the influencers.
Yeah. No, and this is I didn't put this in the article, but like, so they're trying to hire tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of forward deployed engineers, right? So these are the people who are like supposed to be experts to help you implement AI. Where the hell are these people coming from?
Right.
Like you're like, it doesn't, the math doesn't math, right? Like in terms of you're going to create the same problem, which is that a lot of these forward deployed engineers may have no understanding of your business, and so there's potentially going to be unintended consequences in sort of other places, right? I'm sure there are plenty of very qualified forward deployed engineers. I've met many of them, right? But I think when you're hiring at that scale with that speed, right, for these mission critical things, there are going to be gaps in terms of what they're promising versus what is actually going to occur.
Yeah, use your critical thinking skills, right? Consider the source. I mean, Sam Altman just came out this week and said maybe there's not going to be a job apocalypse like we say, right? I
Yeah.
think everyone on the ground, I just said this on another podcast recording, but everyone on the ground that I've talked to that are actually involved in enterprise grade AI on either side as a supplier or a vendor of AI or a consumer, customer of AI, nobody saw a job apocalypse coming. Everyone says it's an enablement play, right? It's going to make your workers more productive, more powerful, and yeah, some jobs will be lost, but those jobs will be shifted to other jobs that are created by AI.
There's certainly no shortage of jobs building data centers at this point, right? Like, but it is a shift of jobs.
Yeah. So technical debt. It seems like AI is ripe for creating a whole new type of technical debt, which is really what we were just talking about with, having to start over, right? Or to protect yourself from having to start over because again, it's that atomization issue, right? You've got people that are doing tactical things and maybe not communicating across the organization. So how do you view AI technical debt and like how big of a problem do you think it's going to be 5 years out or 2 years out?
So I'm looking at this through sort of like the enterprise lens, right? So I think your or an organization's tolerance for technical debt, I think it depends on sort of their definition of what is good enough for what they are trying to accomplish and maybe how much risk they're willing to sort of take with any given system that they're implementing, right? By definition, I would say all of these applications that are vibe coded, particularly by people who are non-engineers, have technical debt in them, right? The technical debt is almost built in because they are not thinking about performance implications. None of these models lead with, unless you're creating skills, sort of least privileges or zero trust sort of principles in terms of mine, right? So they have, sort of things that probably need to be cleaned up inherently as part of being built, right? And I think that is the risk of sort of the democratization in terms of development, which is that like one of the things that engineers think a lot about are all of sort of the supportability, extensibility, scalability, security, et cetera, right? In that we have checks and balances for all of those things likely in our pipelines to make sure that these things are at a reasonable level of quality with all the right code sniffs so that it can be supported by someone else in the organization, et cetera. And so I think with a lot of these applications that are being built, right, they're not going through a sort of a similar level of rigor because I think in some cases people just simply don't know the right questions to sort of ask. And so I think that there is some technical debt there and also just a lack of sort of the platforms necessary in order to manage, monitor, govern a lot of these types of agentic systems. A lot of these frameworks have really only come out in the last 3 to 6 months. And so your ability to sort of really get a single pane of glass in terms of what's going on in your organization across all the different dimensions, particularly if you have tens of thousands of agents, it's difficult. It's not impossible. Again, if you have 4 deployed engineers and you have enough money and you're a large enough organization, I think you can sort of work around that. But I think the point is that at some point this debt is going to come due, right? Which is that you're going to need to make changes. There's going to be an event in production. You're going to have a security breach, and because it is a 100% vibe coded tool, you're sort of at the um, you know risk of just you don't know what was actually built or why it was built. It didn't go through an architectural review, so you're sort of leaving it to the AI to sort of find and remediate whatever issue that sort of could come up. So I think it's an interesting. I think it's going to become an interesting challenge, particularly as these things continue to scale. I would look at it though from sort of the flip side, which is that there's a huge opportunity. This is something that we're doing at Progress, but I know it's not unique to us, which is AI and all these agents are an incredible opportunity for us to start automating to address some of the technical debt that we've sort
Mm.
of taken on as an organization over the years, right? And so we have agents that we are working on to sort of pull security issues from Black Duck or pull third-party libraries that are maybe out of date out of the Black Duck system, pass them to agents and see what type of PR that could be created and to see if we can actually start to mitigate and resolve a good number of issues just fully agentically. And you're not going to get 100%, but if you get a small percentage of those things, right, you can start to sort of work those vulnerabilities down. And I think that that's a great opportunity, right? And I think Mythos and a lot of these other sort of models that are coming out, GPT-5.5, which is apparently nearly as good, right? While they're creating additional technical debt in terms of identifying things that need to be fixed, right? I think it also gives you an opportunity to then go and mitigate some of these risks as well in a more automated way. But there's also the challenge of triaging. Not all of these things are. You get a lot of false positives and noise in terms of any of these security scans that creates a little bit of chaos because yes, it may find 100 issues, only 10 may be relevant for your organization, and there may only be a handful that actually follow the right path where they could actually get fully exploited, but you have to look at each of those, right?
Yeah. We talked about scale a few times in the conversation here. So I think planning for scale requires understanding the economics of these models and the underlying cost structures. So right now, pricing is fluid. We've seen Anthropic take away the all you can eat model and start metering inference costs and token usage. And we're seeing AWS increased the cost for GPUs. And you just told me as we were getting on the podcast here that Microsoft increased the cost for Copilot. So like, how do you deal with this? How do you start to think forward about what the budget implications could be for these projects?
Yeah, so I would say right now is that if anybody has an answer on this, that I'd love for them to sort of call me and you can sort of help me work this out, right? But I think my general sense is that we're all sort of in the same boat trying to sort of figure this out, right? Which is that I think it would be naive, I think, for any of us to not see this day coming where they basically switch from subsidizing the models to doing more of a profit approach. But I think the speed at which this has transacted is taking, I think, a lot of organizations aback. And in some cases, they don't have the controls in place or the reports in place to be able to monitor and forecast these expenses sort of moving forward, right? And so this is certainly what is happening with Microsoft. So for those who are not aware, right? So Microsoft GitHub Copilot has always worked on this premium request model. So every single time that you asked the AI to do something, you would get assigned some number of premium requests, and it would go off and sort of do the work for you and come back. As the models have gotten better and better and have sort of been able to sort of support more complex agentic workflows, the amount of work that you can do for a single premium request has exploded, right? And I think what this was, and again, this is all, conjecture because nobody has actually, I think, officially said this, right? But I think what this created a situation is that I think a lot of the plans that Microsoft were offering became instantly unprofitable, and particularly when you had power users, wildly unprofitable for the organization. To the point where they are losing money, right? And I think this was the same pattern that I think emerged with Anthropic, and a lot of the people that sort of figured out how to do their open claw with their max plan by sort of doing a backdoor in terms of how they could actually secure the inference, right? And so I think a small portion of the user base really was having a very, very outsized impact on Google, on Anthropic, on Microsoft, et cetera, and that they very quickly had to make a change, right? And so why are they making the change, right? Obviously, a lot of these organizations are trying to go public, right? And so I think they needed to start to think about sort of the true economics in terms of the inference. But what the challenge that it's presented is that, like, we now have an enormous amount of uncertainty in terms of forecasting what our inference costs are going to be from a development perspective in terms of funding the engineers. So, and you have sort of a very difficult base of data to work from, because all the data that I have in terms of the usage patterns for the engineers were them using AI that was basically virtually free. And so, when I look at our top 150 users, they're all what I was saying, like YOLOing on like Opus 4.7 and 4.6. And the reality is that I think in most of those use cases, they probably didn't need 4.6 or 4.7, right? But because it was so cheap, they were using it, right? And so now we're trying to figure out what is that right water level in terms of like, what is the appropriate level of usage if you were to use something like Codex or Sonnet 4.6 as your daily driver, going back to the cars, right? In terms of, cost basis, and then trying to be much more intentional around the economics of like, what models are we using for what tasks, thinking more about like, if I'm starting up a project or a new repository, am I assigning a pool of AI to fund that development? Thinking about asking questions when you have users that are spending thousands of dollars a month on AI, what exactly are they doing, right? So all these questions are sort of coming up at the same time, and the data is challenging to say the least in terms of forecasting this, right? So I think it's going to be it's going to have a whole bunch of, I think you could have a whole new show on just the economics of AI, right? Which is that this is going to cause ripples across the industry in terms of, I would sort of predict that there would be some impact in terms of the adoption and growth of Anthropic and some of those vendors when people actually start to see the bills. They're like, oh, I want Anthropic. I was like, I don't think you understand what you're getting into in terms of like the bill, right? And so these trade-offs, I think, are going to become front and center at some point.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. Well, first of all, with these businesses, they use the drug dealer model, right? They get you hooked on something and then they start charging you for it. And we've seen that many times, particularly with social media, right? That's one that comes to mind. But the speed at which the price increases have hit the market is really surprising to me, because since when does Wall Street actually care about profitability anymore, right? Capital keeps flowing to these companies. It's all speculation and betting on their future, and that eventually they'll be able to, be profitable. So it's really surprising to me. It must be loads and loads of cash that they're losing.
Yeah, I think that they're losing stunning amounts of money, right? And so, but I think the economics are really like, when it's free, we work in a global economy, right? And so that there is less expensive labor throughout the world that can do many of these tasks with people, right? And so a lot of these agentic automations, I think, are not going to pass sort of the sniff test in terms, and you see this with OpenClaw and all the people posting about their OpenClaw bills and it's like, well, do you really need to spend all of that money to like manage your inbox and your calendar and some of those other things? So, it's sort of based off of this assumption that the inference was going to continue to get cheaper. And I think that big assumption that we all made maybe 18 months ago is no longer true. And you have sort of this mismatch, right? Which is that it's great that Opus 4.8 came out. Do I really need Opus 4.8 for 90% of what I do? Like, do I need an all-knowing model that speaks every language, that, can decode the Rosetta Stone, and like, probably not, right? Like, I probably need a much smaller model. And it's interesting to me as to how the economics start to shift as organizations start to move to some of these smaller open source models, uh, to offload some of their processing, and don't just go with like the default, which is like the most expensive model, right? Or the one that sort of gives you the best answer because it's the best at sort of deciphering the ambiguity in terms of what you asked it to do, right? Versus like you being better about like, this is what I need to do. This is what my success criteria looks like. This is what I want the output to look like. Like, I think if you do that with some of the less expensive models, you'll get the same result as, or similar results as some of these more expensive models.
Yeah, here at Amplix, we rolled out an enterprise Claude account, and I got credentials to it. I'm one of the few users that are officially allowed to use it. And within 4 hours of getting access to it, I had used all of my allocation.
Yeah, yeah.
And so one thing I learned from that is which model are you using for these tasks, right? But another thing I learned about it was the context window
Mhm.
and making sure that I minimize that, right? Because if it's going back and referencing the full conversation every time, we're wasting money there. So, but these are things that I think like you need to learn these things, and I know you can probably control it at an enterprise level for if you've got a particular initiative that is using Claude, you can map it to the right model, but. What about the individual users, right? How do you educate them and get them to comply with that so that they're more efficient?
The So I think maybe we have sort of a multi approach to this, right? As we're sort of thinking about this through the lens of the engineers, which is that I think previously when a new model was made available, we would make it immediately available to the engineers and they could all go to start experimenting with that. I think what we're going to be moving towards a model is, we're going to let these models sort of soak for a week to try to see if the hype behind them actually matches to the reality in terms of. And so probably the more recent example of this was like Opus 4.7, which is that, whenever these models come out, they're the greatest and best models ever. It's going to change everything. I built a business overnight that's making me $600 a day. And then like, a week later, you actually start to see where the edges really are. And I think with 4.7, I think the majority of our engineers use 4.7 and they're like 4.6 is better, right? If all the instructions better, it's getting up. Again, going to the sort of scale problem. If we had rolled 4.7 out and we have now 1,200 people playing with 4.7, 4.8, I'm sorry, there is a meaningful economic impact there, right? And so again, I was talking about the top users at our organization were all using Opus. Under the new billing, they would be incurring hundreds of dollars of Opus charges per day, right? And so I can't have 1,000 people experimenting with 4.8 to see if it's fit for purpose for their job at several $100s per day, right? We need to basically have some way where we say these are the business cases where we think that Opus is going to be meaningful, run some experiments, and then ultimately be able to say for these projects, this is where we think, or for these repositories, this is where we think Opus is going to drive the most value. And here's the budget that you have. Microsoft today does not offer any capability for doing that type of budgeting, right? So I cannot assign Opus to just the architects in my organization, right? It's an all or nothing, at least the way that our organization is currently set up, which is that if I assign Opus to one person, all 1,275 get it. And I can't, so that limits sort of the flexibility in terms of how we think about this. The other way that we're sort of talking, you were talking about sort of context caching. We actually built a harness that wraps around these coding agents that actually does some management of the context for the users, right? So what the harness does, which is sort of, I think, just sort of a best practice for everybody, is that you want to minimize the number of turns that you're going into the agents with, right? Because it's repassing this context in and out. And we talked about sort of this 80% problem before, which is, can you create a plan that is much more complete in terms of like what you're asking for, what success looks like, so that you're eliminating the ambiguity for the model. right? And I think that that has the biggest impact in terms of how much value you get out of that particular turn that you are sending to the model. And so we have a product that we've been testing in-house that basically helps build that context for the users and also does model routing so that you're using the right model for the right task uh, at the point in time. And I don't have to think about like, oh, I'm writing unit tests. I can just use Haiku here, right? And will help manage some of that expense. So we have sort of like a multidisciplinary approach, I guess, to sort of try to manage this for users. But it is a lift, right? There is a lot of just talking about tokens, you're talking about caches, like it gets complex pretty damn quickly, right?
Yeah. When is the right time to introduce something like that product that you were talking about? Because it sounds to me like as you're starting to scale, you really do need something like that that is going to route to the right model, keep it cost effective, contain the context. I mean, that sounds like an early on thing that you should be adopting.
Yeah, I think it's again, it's a scale problem, right? So if you're managing smaller teams of engineers, it's easier for you to get them all in the same room and sort of have a conversation around what models we're going to be using for what, and you can sort of communicate that maybe during your daily stand-ups or in Slack or whatever mechanism that you're using, right? I think for us the challenge is that these models, the model acceleration and the rate at which they're sort of coming out with new capabilities and Claude Code or Copilot CLI is coming out with new capabilities, right? They're iterating what feels like maybe multiple times a day at this point, right? There is no way that you can diffuse that information in a way that people can sort of absorb it across lots of people,
Yeah.
right? And some of the solutions that the vendors have provided, right? I think there's an auto mode now with Copilot CLI. For those who are not aware, so Copilot CLI is Microsoft's sort of agentic harness that is similar to Codex or to Claude Code. For the Microsoft bashing that I've been doing, it is actually probably the best product that nobody knows about that they have. And it prior to some of them raising the rates was certainly the most cost-effective way to sort of bring agentic workflows to your organization, and I think will still be a very compelling um, alternative to Claude Code with all the governance that you need on the back end in terms of making sure that you're not pulling open source code and things like that. But I think it's a challenge, right? So they have model routers that you can like auto mode. It'll attempt to determine based off of what you're asking what is the best model to use, and they do some model splitting in the back when you have all these sub agents that'll assign different
Mhm.
models to do different tasks. uh, but I think that's good, but I think ultimately organizations are going to want to be more opinionated about what tool they use for what task and not leave it to the model to sort of make those decisions for you. So to answer your question, there are products like this that are starting to emerge. Like I said, we have one that we've been playing with internally, maybe going through some discussions whether or not we want to do a market test with that. But it feels like an opportunity, right? Particularly now that these costs have exploded.
Yeah. Well, sign me up for the beta, please, because
Yeah.
I think let's use it. What I've taken to doing, probably a terrible practice, and I shouldn't admit this on a podcast, but anything that's sensitive, whether it's got PII or IP, I'm running through the business
Yep.
instance, and I'm just using my personal one for anything that is public. So if I'm editing copy for the website, that's going on the website. I don't really care if that gets out in the public domain, right? So I just do it through my personal cloud account.
Yeah, there's a lot of clues. I think most organizations have a data privacy policy, right? And I think the data privacy policy drives a lot of the behavior in terms of where you use AI,
Mhm.
right? And I do the same thing, which is that like this is stuff that everybody knows already. I'm just going to put it in, my corporate GPT account and let it
Yeah.
fly, right?
Yeah. Advice for people listening to this. I mean, everyone's going to be at a different stage. Is there any broad blanket advice that you could give to people to help them implement effectively, adopt effectively, keep it cost effective, keep it secure?
Well, that's a lot, right? But
Big task, right?
I would say I so first of all, I think AI is a participatory sport, right? Like I think the only way to sort of learn this is to actually do it, right? And so a lot of times I find that we are in meetings where we're talking about how we could govern it or talking about how we could deploy it. And it is just way friggin' easier to just go do it and see what happens and learn off of that, right? I think that you learn by doing and you learn by failing, and I think it's critical that you figure out how to reduce that cycle time so that you can run those experiments faster and communicate out to the organization. The second thing that I would say is that like really explain the why and try to have the organization help you solve the problem, right? And so the example that I would give there is that, again, Microsoft dumped these pricing changes on us. We're looking at, what could be 5 to 7x in terms of our monthly bill. And I was just on a champions call this morning and I said, like, I really need your help, like figuring out how we roll this out, right? This is the problem. This is the constraint. This is how much money it's going to cost. This is what we can do from sort of a governance perspective. This is what we can't do. This is what I'm seeing. Like, how should we approach this, right? Because like we're all in it together, right? We're all figuring this out. And so I think if you adopt that more broadly at an organization perspective, and again, this goes back to culture, then I think you have a chance in terms of like rolling this out and getting some velocity in terms of the adoption.
And I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I could talk to you all day, but not even my mother could listen to me for more than an hour.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap it up here. But thank you so much for joining us and for your time and expertise.
Great to be on, Shawn. Thanks again.